So welcome to today's webinar. We're lucky enough to have a great presenter talking to us about leveraging your CLC's annual report. My name's Carly Hansen. I'm the Sector Sustainability Coordinator at Community Legal Centres Queensland. And before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're holding today's webinar. In Brisbane, they're the Turrbal and the Yagara people. I wish to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future, and acknowledge the very important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue to play in our society. As today's webinar is being viewed by people throughout Queensland and Australia, I'd also like to pay respect to the traditional owners of the land throughout the country and extend a really warm welcome to any First Australians listening in today. So this morning we've got Stephen Varady, who is a Board Director and Chairman of the Awards Committee for the Australasian Reporting Awards, joining us. So he'll be taking us through your annual reports and how you can use them as an opportunity to share your performance story with stakeholders, remind yourselves and others of your vision, and they also can provide a chance to communicate a coherent and compelling story of your success, or sometimes your disappointments, and engender trust from your stakeholders by providing information on your business practices and the governance principles that you adhere to. So Stephen's going to talk us through the most critical elements of an excellent annual report in terms of content and communication, as well as providing some free resources you can use when preparing your next annual report. So I'll hand over to Stephen in a moment and he can tell you a bit more about himself. But some housekeeping before we do that. So today's webinar is being recorded and we'll have the recording available to download later today or tomorrow. The PowerPoints have been sent out to everyone who registered this morning, and you can also download them from our website and from the handout section of the GoToWebinar control panel. You can ask questions as we go through the session by typing them into the question box on the GoToWebinar control panel, or at the end of the presentation you can press the button that looks like a hand and we can unmute you if you'd like to ask your question verbally. So we don't have any polls today. As I mentioned, we'll do questions at the end, and I'll now hand over to Stephen and come back to you at the end of the session. Thanks, Stephen.
Okay, thanks very much, Carly. So hopefully everyone can hear me. Thanks very much for the introduction. So my name's Steve Varady, as Carly said, and today I'm going to talk to you all about annual reporting. And despite the fact that this is electronic, I can't actually hear you, I can imagine the collective groans that are kind of floating around already. But annual reporting really is exciting stuff. At least I think so anyway. Now, 45 minutes is, which I'm going to speak to today, is a bit of a drop in the ocean in terms of annual report writing information. So I won't be discussing the detail of every tiny piece of information that we like to capture in an annual report today, but I'll try to stick to talking more about principles and practices that you might wish to consider the next time you're thinking about your annual report. And so today I'll share with you what I consider to be the hallmarks of excellence in an annual report. And so by the end of the session, hopefully you'll be able to take a few things away that will prove useful in making your next annual report one step closer to excellence. Now, I will admit to reading from notes today, and the main reason is not because I don't really know what I'm talking about, but I get so excited about annual reporting that I'll continue on for hours. So I need my notes to make sure I stay on track in terms of the time. All right, so just a little bit about me. Hopefully once we get there we go, it seems to be working. Okay, so a little bit about me, just to give you a little bit of confidence in who's speaking to you today, or at least the bits that are relevant to annual reporting. I've been involved with the annual reporting for about 15 years now, and been a part of the Australasian Reporting Awards organisation for almost as long. As Carly said, I'm currently a director on the board of the Australasian Reporting Awards. I'm also chair of the Awards Committee and coordinator of the Public Sector Federal and International Division of the Awards. And every year I read around 200 to 250 reports. Of those I review in great detail about 50 to 60. So I do look at a lot of reports. I also speak regularly to many of our federal government departments, a number of New Zealand ministries and statutory authorities, and also large multinationals. So recently I spoke to Malaysian Airports Corporation, Sarawak Energy Company as well. And obviously I speak to those people about annual reporting. Reports that I've been involved in directly with, either delivering or my teams have delivered, have picked up over a 10-year period. We picked up around 75 awards for excellence at international, national and state level. Now, that's not kind of just to tell you how good a job I did, but it's more about giving you some level of confidence in my annual reporting pedigree. So I do have, as I said, I really like annual reporting. I have a genuine passion for annual reporting. I believe it's more accurately described psychologically as an obsession, however. And as a sort of testament to that, I currently have about 3,500 annual reports in my possession. But they're hidden in storage at the moment because the last time that we moved house, I told my wife that I threw them away. And I didn't actually throw them away. I put them in storage, but she doesn't know that yet. So I really do have a thing about annual reporting. The only other thing to say is that I do tend to talk fairly quickly, but because I do have a lot to say, but I'll try and slow down today so that at least some of what I've got to say is reasonably coherent. Okay, so without further ado, the big question, why even produce an annual report? And this is something I think we need to have a really good chat about before we even get into the rest of the report, because it kind of sets the scene. And you'll find that scene setting is a bit of a consistent theme throughout today's presentation. So why produce an annual report? I mean, after all, they're generally boring, no one reads them, and they rarely achieve what they set out to achieve. But I'll talk a little bit more about what that is in a minute. So generally, the primary driver for delivering an annual report is to fulfil an organisation's legislative and regulatory obligations. We do them because we have to do them, but there's lots of other reasons as well. And let's face it, if you have to do it and you're going to take the time to do it, you may as well do it and make it a little bit more useful. So an annual report, and your annual report done well, is a vital communication tool. It's an essential part of effective corporate governance. Now, annual reports can also reflect an organisation's commitment to openness and accountability. They help ensure efficient resource use and provide value for money services to stakeholders. So with your annual report, you should be aiming to provide your stakeholders with several things. You should be able to provide them with an account of your revenue and related policies, how you've used the public funds or their donations. You should be able to provide them with an insight of the challenges and opportunities that have influenced your actions and the delivery of your strategic outcomes. You can use it to help communicate your priorities for the year ahead. And you can help by providing help stakeholders understand how you provided good governance through accurate, balanced and transparent assessment of your achievement in implementing your long-term strategic, corporate and operational plans as you measure them against a range of performance indicators. Your annual report should be an important component of your organisational performance monitoring process, which obviously feeds into your ongoing organisational planning and then resource allocation. So in other words, your cycle of continuous improvement. What did we want to achieve? Did we achieve it? And what do we need to do better? And the annual report can help to communicate all of those messages. So I guess we have to do an annual report, and we thought, well, we now know what sort of things, you know, that an annual report can do, but why strive for excellence instead of mediocrity? And there's a whole range of reasons that I recommend that you do as good a report as you can do. So some of the reasons or the ways an excellent report can help your organisation, it can help achieve continuous improvement in your performance. As I already just said that. It can help you know and help you communicate your community leadership and social responsibility to people. It can help you have a clear long-term vision. Annual reports are generally, the biggest readers of an annual report are people within an organisation themselves. So if everybody knows what direction you're going in, then it makes it much easier to get everybody heading in the same direction, which therefore assists you in becoming a genuine corporate entity and not a dysfunctional organisation. It can assist you in conducting a rigorous self-assessment of your performance and one that you can be held accountable to. After all, you're bearing your corporate soul to all of your stakeholders. You're being open and honest with them about your performance. It helps, and therefore, it helps you to be, as I said, open, and have ethical and high standards of behaviour. By publishing and communicating the standards of behaviour that you hold yourself to, allows others to also keep an eye on you and make sure that you are upholding those behaviours. It helps you to be a democratic organisation, inform your stakeholders how you do business. It also provides an opportunity to publicly document responsibilities for your board members, your executives and your employees, so they also know the standards of behaviours and responsibilities that they're expected to be held accountable to. It assists you in communicating the fact that you use good management practices to deliver the services, and it helps to demonstrate continually improving trends in your results. It helps to improve your corporate governance. And this is really important, because once you start to communicate to people higher levels of disclosure and transparency in the way you do business, that can help engender trust amongst your stakeholders. It can help to improve the usefulness of your communications. It can help and maintain improve your reputation as an organisation. And a really excellent annual report can help to make you highly regarded as a role model in whatever industry sector you belong to. So they're just there are more benefits of excellence in annual reporting, and that's just some of the ones that I can think of at the moment. Okay, so we have to do an annual report. I guess I've given you a lot of reasons why I think if you're going to do it, you may as well do it really well. So if that's the case, then what are we looking for, or what do we mean by excellence in an annual report? So in answer to that question, in my opinion, an excellent annual report is one that answers the following questions. First of all, what did we want to achieve, and did we achieve it? So what was our ultimate destination as an organisation, and does our report explain to the readers if we've progressed towards it? Did we meet our strategic outcomes and our vision, and to what degree? At the end of the day, it's all about performance, and this is the main game for most annual reports. And in my opinion, it's one that's done the most poorly. It's an opportunity to let stakeholders know, did you do the things that you said you would do? In other words, in order to achieve the outcomes and your vision, you come up with plans and things you'd like to do. So did you do those things that you said you'd do? Did you deliver on those plans? Did the community and your stakeholders get what you said you would give them? And the final question that an excellent annual report also answers is, it lets people know if you did them in accordance with principles of good governance and values for money and effective business practices. Anyone can deliver anything given enough money and time, but you have an obligation to the communities that you serve to do things in a way that doesn't waste money and that delivers best quality services for a reasonable cost. So therefore, you have to do it in a way, or a reasonable cost. You also have to do it in a way that demonstrates accountable and ethical behaviour, robust and transparent decision-making, and good stewardship and leadership. So an excellent annual report allows you to do that. So now you've sat down, you decided, you know, you want to deliver an excellent annual report, and you know what you have to do. We get to the really hard bit about how do we actually deliver a report that answers these questions. I'll try and make this as concise as possible, but as you'll kind of work out, it does start to get a little bit complex. But fundamentally, the way you deliver an excellent an annual report is by applying a set of best practice principles that relate to the content of the report. In other words, what is your story, and the communication aspects, which is how do you tell your story. Now, there's often a lot of debate about what's more important, whether it's content or communication, but from my perspective, they both have an essential part to play, and each relies on the other to deliver a truly effective report. Really, really good content with poor communication is just going to end up sitting in a drawer and nobody's ever going to read it. And really good communication without the content, I can't remember who said it, but somebody said that communication without content is just decoration. So the point is you need both. So I'll talk a little bit more about each of those now. So in terms of content, we need to consider an awful lot if we're talking about the bits of information that actually make up an annual report. Now, I can't possibly go over every piece of content in an annual report in the next 40 minutes, The ARA, or the Australasian Reporting Award, has a set of best practice criteria that we have on our website that we publish, and that provides guidance to organisations who are seeking to improve their annual reports. Carly, I believe, has a web link to that criteria page. So if, and I think she's going to send it out to you following the webinar today. So if you want to go to that site and have a look, that actually lists all the individual pieces of information that we believe you need to include in an excellent annual report. So rather than talk about every single individual piece of information, I'll talk about a little bit more in general terms about the content, and you can apply this to any of the elements that you see on the website when you include them in your report. So the bits of pieces that I look at in terms of content are type, quality, placement, and value. Now, in terms of types, generally, there's two types of information that you'd really like to see in content in an annual report. The first one is mandatory. Now, mandatory is all that specific legislative stuff that you're required to put in there by the regulators. Now, these are the things that you have to include. And whilst including this stuff will keep you out of jail, in terms of meeting your legislative obligations, it certainly won't win you any awards for excellence if that's all you do. And in fact, the actual legislative reporting obligations for charities and not-for-profits are really quite vague and not particularly lengthy. So if you only include what you have to include as a charity, there's not going to be much information in your report at all. Normally, however, it does include the basics around who you are, basic information around governance, and very basic information around governance, and some type of expression of financial accountability would also be included in the mandatory stuff. Obviously, the other type is non-mandatory, and I've split that into a couple of different types of information, contextual information and the nice to have. So we'll talk about the contextual information, and this is really, really important stuff, and this is what a lot of reports seem to lack. This is the information that not only provides the reason that the reader should even care about your report, but this is what sets the framework for the rest of your report. It's no point having a book full of answers if no one knows what the questions are. And it's this information, a contextual information, that provides the questions. So in other words, what the report is responding to. As I said earlier, the ARO website lists those elements of reporting that we believe you need to include to achieve excellence. So I won't go over every individual piece of information. But in general terms, the contextual information consists of background information, such as who you are, where do you draw your authority, who do you service, how do you fit into the bigger picture. We like to know where you are, so geographically, where are you located? Why are you here? What's your vision and your mission? What are your key strategic objectives? What services do you deliver in order to achieve those outcomes? Who do you serve? This includes information about the community and political environment within which you operate, so the reader understands how you fit in. Where do you come from? Information about your operating environment, so what's changed or what is changing internally and externally. Again, all of this information is about painting a picture to the reader in terms of the challenges that you're facing. Now, contextual information also includes information in terms of your performance, which I believe, as I've already said, is one of the most important aspects of performance reporting. This is where you provide the reader with a summary of your strategic intent. In other words, where are we going? So what do we want to achieve? Now, this relates to your vision and strategic outcomes. This is where you clearly articulate your destination, and it also enables you to articulate a small number of plain English outcomes so that everybody understands how you're going to get there. It's very difficult to explain to a reader that you're getting closer to a destination in your report if you're unable to, or you have not at any point identified what your destination was. Now, much of this information around destination, your vision, your strategic objectives, and your key activities can be found in your strategic plans. At the end of the day, that's what your annual report should be fundamentally reporting against, performance against your strategic plan. Now, I did, in order to prepare for this webinar today, I spent quite some time trawling through your websites to try and find strategic plans. Now, I've been reliably informed that you're all supposed to have them, but found very few on your website. So I can only assume that they're all written, but you just haven't published them on your website. And similar to an annual report, if you have to do something, you may as well do it in a way that makes it useful and you get the most benefit out of it. This is really important information in terms of your vision, your mission, your key objectives, and it's useful to your stakeholders and your own organisation, and it cannot do its job if it's left in a drawer somewhere and no one gets to see it. So my point would be, I suggest you publish it, and even if you don't publish it, you need to include a summary of that at the start of your annual report. It also includes information about how you will achieve your objectives. So this is an opportunity for you to include key initiatives, programs, or key objectives. Explain critical activities that will be undertaken in order to achieve your vision and outcomes. And finally, how will we know when you get there? How will we know, or the reader know, when you do achieve your outcomes? And this is a section where you need to include some of your key performance metrics, your indicators, measures, whatever you want to call them, but highlighting what evidence you intend to present to support your claims of good or bad performance. Now, the only other section in terms of content that I'll talk about in the non-mandatory stuff is the nice to have. So after the contextual information, the nice to have is where you get down into the nitty-gritty and where you really begin to discuss things like key activities, projects, services you deliver. This is the things we did kind of information. And again, this needs to be communicated in a way that assists the reader in understanding how all the doing things progress you towards the destination that you've articulated in your strategic plans and hopefully the early part of your report. In most reports I read, everybody has the mandatory stuff. People then spend lots and lots and lots of time on the nice to have. The thing that they all miss is the whole contextual part of the report. The thing that gives the whole report meaning is the thing that they do most poorly. So just keep that one in mind when you're writing your annual report. Destination, if we don't know where your destination is, we have, it makes no sense to tell me that you've travelled 1,000 kilometres. All right, next thing we have a look at in terms of content is the quality. Now, by quality, I'm sort of refers to a number of things, and it's pretty much applicable to whichever piece of information you're referring to. Now, when I look at report contents, I look at each of the critical elements. As I've discussed previously, they are listed on their website, and I ask the following questions. It kind of ramps up in levels of detail from box ticking through to the key messages, which is the top level, even though it's on the bottom of the slide. But it ramps up in levels of detail and therefore subsequent usefulness of the content. So the first level, if you manage to get it, is what I call box ticking, and this is where you look at criteria. On our criteria, we say you need information about equal opportunity, so EEO, and a box ticking might mean that you include a statement in your report that says we had an EEO plan. That's great. You tick the box, you move on, but it doesn't really tell me anything. If you want to do a little bit better, then we move on to talking about we had an EEO plan, and then you discuss some of the things that were done with your EEO plan. Discusses some of the key actions that were undertaken. This is even better. The next level up in terms of information is, now I know that you've included it, now I know something you've done, is if you can relate that information to what was achieved. If your EEO plan had outcomes, did the actions undertake impact them, and how? It might be that perhaps you're trying to achieve satisfaction of a particular EEO target group through your activities. That might be important, and that might be improved through the action. So if you can link your activity to the outcome you're trying to achieve, that's even better. Do you provide evidence over time? So this relates to evidence in terms of supporting data of both what was done. For example, the number of EEO awareness sessions conducted might be something you decide to include. And then data in terms of what was achieved. So if you're talking about a particular EEO target group, you might wish to measure the level of satisfaction of that EEO target group within the workplace following the actions that you've undertaken. And then you can present that data, which demonstrates that, yes, we increased their satisfaction level or we didn't. Okay, so it's all very well making claims to having achieved certain outcomes in your report, but your report will have much more credibility if you can actually demonstrate the evidence upon which you make these claims. The reality is that I believe that trust in both organisations and even private sector organisations now is at an all-time low. So anything that you can do to help engender a greater level of trust is good, and providing the evidence is one of the things that can do that. Now, while we're talking about evidence and data, think about its presentation when you put it in the report. Do you put it in a chart or do you put it in a table? Do you leave it buried in the text? If one was cynical, you'd probably say, well, if it's not very good news, I'll probably leave it buried in the text. However, if it's put in a chart, make sure that the chart makes sense. Make sure that you provide an explanation. I've seen a lot of reports where they have pages and pages and pages of fabulous charts or graphs, whatever term you like to use, but they provide no explanation. So a graph must, or a chart must have an explanation, and an explanation is not that the graph went up or the graph went down. Captain Obvious can see that. What the reader wants to know is, if it went up, did it go up by the amount was expected or not expected? Did it achieve the target it was expected to achieve? If it didn't, why not? What are we going to do about it? That's the kind of thing that we need to know if you're going to put charts in there. The other one is if you have trend over time information, there's no point putting it in a table because tables don't communicate trends very well. As I said, if I was cynical, perhaps if it's a bad trend, you might leave it in a table. If it's a good trend, you put it in a graph, then it looks much better. Now, the final thing is that every annual report should have a theme or some type of key messaging in it. So if you've written that content really well, it'll also go some way towards communicating or supporting the key messages. So for example, if we use our EEO example, if you were trying to send a message about the importance of organisational values, it might be that you make sure that information is written in a way so that it's linked back in a subtle way to that message of organisational values. So that's the sort of levels of quality that I look for in every single piece of information that's included in an annual report. Placement's another thing that's really important with the content. The first and most obvious question is it even there? So did you place it there at all? If you have, is it in the most appropriate place? Now there's a couple of aspects to this. The first one is, in terms of appropriate, is it the appropriate place in terms of does it do the job it's intended to do? So if you have a summary of your strategic plan and outcomes, there's no point putting that in the back of the report. That needs to be up the front. That's where it's going to do the best job because it's introducing and contextualizing your story. Contents, I read a report only recently. They had the contents page on page 25 of the report, of a 200-page report. So when I already read 25 pages and then I managed to get to a page that told me where I'd just been for the last 15 minutes, which seemed a little bit silly. So things need to be in the right place to do the job. The other one is that you need to keep in mind when you're doing your annual report that there's certain places that people expect to see things. So people expect to see the financial information at the back. If you put it at the front, there's a danger that people will either not read it or they'll miss it completely or they won't be able to find it. So innovation in annual reporting is all well and good, but the vast majority of people that read these things in any great detail tend to be old like me. So you need to put stuff where we expect to find it. A favourite thing of government departments in particular is to bury lots of information right up the back in appendixes. So you read the whole report, then you can't find the information you want. You go through all of the financials, you still can't find the information you want. And just as you throw it back onto the coffee table, it falls open at an appendix on page 300, which gives you the information you need. So just make sure that the information is put in the place where it's easiest to find and most appropriate to do its job. Okay, another little really important thing to consider with information, and it's particularly important for you guys, because the value of the information has to be worthwhile. You are generally small organizations. In fact, some I think you've only got 4 or 5 or 6 people. You don't have massive resources. So you really need to ensure that you get the biggest bang for your buck in the stuff that you include in your annual report. You need to ensure that every single thing you put in your annual report adds value. You need to understand why you're including it. What's the purpose of putting that piece of information in it? If you don't know or you can't justify why you're putting a particular piece of information in there, then don't include it. Now, this assessment of the information applies equally to mandatory information as it does to non-mandatory. just because you have to include information, you really should still take the time to understand its value. Why do the regulators see this information as necessary? And if you can understand why the regulators want to know that, you can then present it in a way that actually makes sense. One of the problems, for example, that we have with, I believe we have with financial statements now, is that they've become so standardized over and so regulated over the years that many financial people simply include the information in there that the box says they have to put in there. They don't fully understand why they want to know it. The reasons, the initial reasons for including the information have long been lost in the mists of time. And so when you try to read financial statements these days, even accountants will tell you that a lot of it doesn't make any sense. And that's a lot to do with the fact that people don't understand why it needs to be included, and therefore don't understand the value of it. So being really careful and understanding why you're including information is important. Annual reports are big enough, although most of yours I noticed were quite small, but that's because they're kind of missing a few pieces of information. But annual reports are big enough without including superfluous, low-value information. It simply detracts from key messages and it adds to the cost. So really have a good think about what you're going to put in there and whether it's necessary or not. All right. So that's kind of what my view on the contents part of annual reporting. The other important aspect of annual reports is communication. I mentioned earlier about this never-ending conflict that exists between the content and communication. But as I said earlier as well, the best content in the world isn't worth anything if no one reads it. Or, even worse, if they read it but then take away incorrect messages, or they focus on the wrong things, or they're unable to find the things they want. And this is where the communication aspects of a report become very important. Now, interestingly enough, I can tell almost as soon as I pick up an annual report whether the project lead was a governance professional or a communication specialist. An annual report, however, really needs the expertise of both areas. And if I'm looking at a report but I'm not sure who was leading it, generally that indicates that there was a really good relationship between the governance and the communications people. Now, in most of your cases, I assume that will probably be the same person. I'm sure you don't have an entire graphic design area and an entire governance area. So if it's one person doing it, then you really need to be both content and communication, or skilled up in terms of both content and communication. Now, in order for a report to be effective and all your hard work not to end up consigned to the bookshelf forever, there are a couple of key areas of communication that you need to pay attention to. And the first one is writing. Second one's design. I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, in terms of writing, contrary to popular belief, writing is a skill that not everyone possesses, despite what they might think. I'm not really too sure what goes on, but it's a bit like handing somebody a microphone at the karaoke bar. All of a sudden, people seem to think they can sing just because they got the microphone. And it's similar with a pen. They all think they can write. There is a real art to writing. Now, it's my recommendation that you realise and acknowledge this fact. Now, questions that immediately come to mind when I'm reading an annual report are, does it flow? Right? Is it an easy read? Does it feel like one document written in a similar style, or lots of short stories cobbled together? A classic example in larger organisations is to just send out a thing to the particular branch manager or area manager, say, give us 500 words on what you did this month, give us 500 words on what you did this month, and you do the same thing, and we'll just staple it together in the office. Not a good idea. My advice is, if you can afford it, use a single external creative writer to write your report. Now, if you can't afford that, then at least try to get just one person in your organisation to write the whole thing, or at the very least, ensure that one person edits the entire document. Not only will this produce a report with a similar feel and writing style, but it also has the added bonus of getting an independent check on the contents and information, particularly around the use of jargon. Getting the area experts to write an annual report or their piece of an annual report is absolutely the worst thing you can do. Experts know too much and they assume too much. And so therefore, as a general rule, they rarely explain it very well for the great unwashed. So don't get them to do it. Now, if you can afford an external person, it's a good idea. The other thing that an external writer is really good to do, and helpful is that if you have some recalcitrant contributors who are always late or not providing the input that you're requiring, external writers can generally go and give them a bit of a hard time, because in my experience I find that it's usually the CEO or the managing director that's dragging their feet, and the consultant can go and give them a hard time without being concerned about whether they're going to get fired the next day, whereas you can't really do that. So that's an added benefit of an external person if you've got one. In terms of comprehension, is it aimed at the correct level? Now, my understanding is that the best practice for writing news reports is that all news reporting should be written to the comprehension level of a 12-year-old. Right? So if your teenagers at home basically can't understand it, then it will probably miss the mark. This also harks back to the not getting the experts to write it, because once again, they tend to be a little jargonistic and a little technical and don't write it at the correct level for people to understand and read easily. I believe there was a study done at Stanford several years ago where people were asked to rate the writing of a number of experts, and it turned out that the more technical and more difficult the writing, the less kudos the people that were reading it actually gave them, and they didn't really like it. So there's no problem. It's not seen as dumbing down the report. It's actually seen as being much more open and engaging with your stakeholders. Delivering key messages. Does your report deliver key messages? I mentioned this earlier quickly before. Before you launch into the development of your report each year, sit down and determine what key message, what theme or some messages, if any, you want to communicate, and then keep them consistent throughout the report. A good writer can do this in a subtle way. All right. So if you have a key message around a particular outcome you want to achieve, you can write the report in a way that subliminally supports people's understanding of your achievement of that outcome. Use of active subheadings is the last thing I'll talk about. Now, I apologise for those that know what an active subheading is. For those that don't, this is something a professional writer should do, and it's something that you should also consider writing using yourself if you write it. Now, by active subheadings, what I mean is a subheading or paragraph heading that gives a message about the upcoming content of that paragraph. And it can do two things. It can help the reader make a decision if they want to read further by engaging the reader. And the second thing it does, it can sell key messages that the reader can take away even if they don't read the whole story. Many people rarely read, or very few people read the whole story in your annual report, but what they do is they graze or they browse through it and they'll take away the headings and bits and pieces. So that's an opportunity for you to send them messages. So as an example, you might have a subheading in your employment area which says EEO implementation plan. Not particularly engaging, not particularly informative. Instead of having a subheading of EEO implementation plan, consider using something like our warm and welcoming workplace. Okay, so even if they don't read the thing, that's a little positive message that will land in their brain and they'll take it away. Classic one in local government is parks maintenance. Doesn't sound particularly exciting. Instead of parks maintenance, if you read a heading that said improving the beauty of our parks, once again, it's engaging. And even if you don't read all about the amount of mowing that they did and the amount of mulching they did, which in and of itself is not particularly exciting, the reader will take away a positive messaging about the parks, about improving and about beauty. So it's just a little trick to try and get some information across to people every opportunity you can. All right, design, we'll quickly go through this one. So that's a little bit about the writing. The other aspect of communication is design. First and most importantly is structure. Okay, no matter how well written your report is, if it's just slabs and slabs and slabs of unbroken text, page after page, people are not going to engage in it and not going to read it. And so this is where design comes into its own. Over recent years, there's been lots of people now have desktop publishing applications which give you all the tools to do all fancy, great design things. I just warn that just because you got the tools in the toolbox doesn't mean you can use them, as my many failed attempts at home renovation can attest to. Okay, I've got lots of tools, but not everything's particularly successful. So as with most aspects of annual reporting, there are a number of things that need to be considered with design. So we're starting with the structure. Now this relates to a little bit to the placement that we talked about earlier. There's many structures that you can use for your annual report. You can follow an organisational structure, a service delivery structure, a strategic plan structure, but whatever you choose, it must have a logical, coherent, consistent structure, and ideally, one that's been communicated at the front of the document. Now, my advice is to use your strategic plan as a framework for your annual report and report against it. All you then need to do is make sure that you ensure that the services and projects you deliver somehow or other are acknowledged in terms of their contribution towards the strategic outcomes that you've got in your plan. You could also lay out or structure your report in accordance with your organisational structure. So you might have each branch by branch or a division by division that delivers certain services. That's just as good. The only thing you need to make sure of is if you're talking about your, say, your earthworks division, you need to explain all that activity the earthworks division has done and how that relates to supporting and delivering your strategic outcomes and vision at some point. The other thing that I'll talk about in terms of structure is that often annual reports are quite big. They have lots and lots and lots of information. And most people, I think the research demonstrates, spend less than 60 seconds looking at your annual report. So any information you want to get across to them, you need to get it across big, bold, and early. So the way to do that is through structuring a report in a cascading levels of complexity. So at the front of the report, you have a high-level summary, followed by a little bit more detail. Further into the report, you would then have each of your strategic outcome sections or divisional sections with a summary start page with some really key information on it, and that's followed by more detail after that. That way, somebody flicking through your document can at least take away a summary version of what you're trying to discuss. I was talking to Carly earlier on, and she also mentioned that she saw a couple of annual reports where the organisation not only provided an annual report, but they also provided a summary version of the annual report. That's good if you have a really large report, but I'm not sure it's applicable to most of you guys who seem to have fairly small organisations, but it's something to consider. All right, page layout. You need to consider page layout in design. Again, endless possibilities, but decisions like whether you have 2, 3, or 1 column can have an impact on the look and feel of a report. Too many columns and your report will feel cluttered and not inviting to read. The use of white space is a really good design tool and it's important, but you need to be careful, particularly as a charity or not-for-profit, because too much white space can look a little indulgent. Which is not really good in our current climate of austerity, and particularly, as I said, for charities and not-for-profits. If you've got important information, put it on the page first. Don't put it in the last paragraph and the last column on the right-hand page. Nobody will see it. Important things first, or highlight them to attract attention. Just be careful. Some people get a bit carried away with the old highlights and bells and whistles. They put so many on a page that the reader then no longer knows what to look at. And the thing you want to stand out doesn't. So just be careful with that. Just check the time. Okay, so font, we're nearly there. Font is something that some people have they've really spent their entire lives looking at fonts. They've written entire volumes on the most appropriate use of them. My view would be, if you don't know any better, simple is best. Simple colors, simple fonts. Don't be very careful if you want to use sexy colors on fonts and sexy background colors, because sometimes they don't work. There's a significantly large proportion of our population who have color perception issues, and once you start to put colors that relate to each other close together, they no longer are able to be read. Purple on grey, for example, is bad, and believe it or not, I've seen it. Font styles, as I said, are important to aid reading, and simple is again best. Use sans serif fonts where you can. They're the fonts without the little squiggly things on the tops and the bottoms. Okay, when we're talking about text, size is important. It must be big enough to comfortably be read. Now, don't be tempted to shrink the font in order to meet a page number requirement. Okay, so if you've got, oh, we've got 3 sentences, they're too long, let's just shrink all the font and squeeze it on 1 page. My advice would be leave the font size alone and edit the document or edit the story to remove the extra 3 sentences. That's what I'll say about fonts. Graphics. Graphics are also really important in an annual report because they help to break up those slabs of text. They provide visual interest, and if they're done well, they can convey a lot of information quickly. Just make sure that they're meaningful. Don't have a diagram that then requires 3 pages to explain their diagram. it means they're going to miss the mark. And also make sure if you do graphics and diagrams, they actually communicate the messages or help communicate the messages rather than confuse them. Use them fairly sparingly. And in terms of sparingly, I'll just have a quick one about infographics. This seems to be something that's crept into annual reports over recent years. I read one the other day, 56 individual different infographics. You don't have to have an infographic beside every heading. The point of infographics is to try and provide a visual link between common pieces of information within a report. So that if I see a little smiley face on page 1, then I see a smiley face on page 20 and a smiley face on page 63, I can go, oh, okay, those 3 pieces of information clearly relate to the smiley face outcome we want to achieve. All right, so use them for what they're meant to be used for, which is aiding navigation and linking content with common ideas, not just an infographic for everything. Final one on design is photography. This is not a requirement of an excellent annual report, contrary to popular belief. There are many other innovative ways to inject visual interest in a report, and I've just mentioned some of those. And in fact, photos are probably the laziest and least imaginative way of doing it. However, if you choose to use photos, please remember they must be relevant. I recently looked at a report that had a herd of goats as a photograph on the commencement of the financial statements. Now, I'm not sure what that particular organisation's accounting team thought of being portrayed as a herd of goats. I couldn't understand the relevance and they couldn't explain it to me. They just thought it was a nice photo. That's great, but make sure they're relevant and they support your communication and your messages. Make sure they're original. In other words, don't get on and Google photos of good-looking solicitors with, you know, young, trendy, whatever. Go and get some pictures of real people in your organisation, of real activities within your organisation, not photo stock. Make sure they're high quality. These days, there's no particular need to shrink your PDF to the size of a pinhead. Most people have high-speed broadband. You can use high-quality photography so they don't pixelate out when you zoom in on a page. And make sure they're captioned. There's no point having pictures of all sorts of people doing all sorts of things if nobody knows what it is. Okay, 2 more minutes if you'll indulge me, ladies and gentlemen. That's all I've got to say about excellence in reporting in terms of content and communication. So just some final tips. I understand that you guys are mostly relatively small teams and you probably end up with one person doing the whole report, and it's probably the junior woodchuck who doesn't know any better when they say, oh, you can do the annual report this year. And they go, oh, that sounds like a good idea. Many small organisations complain to me about a lack of resources and their ability to achieve excellence. But I'd argue that this is not the case. I would rather have a committee of 1 doing a report than a cast of thousands. It really is much simpler. Getting agreement from 15 departments and a herd of solicitors is, for example, time-consuming and often soul-destroying. National Australia Bank spends around $500,000 to $750,000 on their annual report. And yes, it is an excellent report, but I can actually attest to you it is a nightmare to produce and deliver simply due to the size and complexity of the organisation. Organisations like that also have a massive legal liability. They need to make sure that they don't say something in their report that somebody then picks up, loses money on, and then sues the bank. So it's just an extraordinarily complex process to go through. Seriously, small organisation is much better. There are also some small organisations who are currently delivering excellent annual reports. Judicial Commission of New South Wales is one, and the New South Wales Audit Office. Now, both of those organisations are long-time gold quality reports, and they have very small staff and a very small organisation. In terms of some really excellent charities, Cancer Council of New South Wales does a really good annual report, and Bridge Housing, although Bridge Housing are more of a corporation type thing, but they're also not-for-profits and they do good reports. I've mentioned quite a number of times already about the strategic plan and having one on your vision. Reality is that you cannot deliver an excellent annual report without a solid strategic plan in place. After all, this report is in response to that. So without that strategic plan, you're just delivering a journal, a diary of stuff you did with no idea as to what you achieved and no ability to explain it to your readers. It doesn't have to be a huge or complicated strategic plan, but you must have something that allows you to understand your destination if you are to report on progress towards getting there at any point. And my final point is, don't try and fix everything at once. Be realistic and in what you can achieve, and take small steps towards excellence. I don't want to offend anybody, but most of your reports have a way to go if you want to achieve excellence, and I really wouldn't try and do it all at once. The only other thing to mention really quickly is, I mentioned already that on our ARA website we have a set of criteria, which I believe Carly's going to send you a web link for. We also have a guide to how to write an annual report, which is a step-by-step, day-by-day, almost diary of what you should be doing and at what point you should be doing it, on how to write an annual report. And I think Carly's also got the link for that, which I'm sure she's going to send out. All you need to do is just register, and you can then download a copy of that, and hopefully you will find that of some use as well. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is all I've got to say. So do we have any questions?
All right, thanks, Stephen. That was fabulous, and some really great tips that I think you know, not too difficult to achieve, especially if we're doing the, don't fix it all at once way of thinking. So, folks, there are a couple of questions that have come through. Just a reminder that you can ask your question by typing that into the GoToWebinar control panel in the question box. So firstly, this one is maybe a little bit more of a comment, but Stephen, happy for your thoughts on this. So Drew has said that a question they always ask themselves each year is whether they should have the annual report professionally published, i.e. a glossy brochure. They're a small CLC, and they are concerned that if they did so, they'd be perceived as wasting public funds. On the other hand, if they're targeting donations and other kinds of key stakeholders, perhaps the glossy brochure would have a bigger impact. Do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, look, I suppose it really depends on the level of skills of the that particular organisation. So if you have the skill sets that allow you to effectively communicate what it is you want to communicate, then by all means I do it in-house rather than give somebody else all of the hard-earned cash. It doesn't have to be a great big glossy document. It just needs to be effective at communicating what you want to communicate. In saying that, there is, I guess, and there is a contrary argument that would suggest that we have to, to be successful, you have to look successful. But I think particularly in the charities world, you do run a real danger of looking a little bit too indulgent, and then people start to say, well, I'm not going to give you more money because, look, clearly you're not using it in the area that's used for. So I'd probably lean towards, if I've got the skills in-house, do it in-house. If you need to make it a little bit more professional, my advice would be to jump onto the ARA website, have a look at the Gold Award winners, pick out the charities amongst those, and then steal some of their ideas when you do your own annual report. Plagiarism is rife in the annual report world. There's not very many innovative and novel thoughts, and we all steal off each other. So that'd be probably the best thing you could do.
Excellent advice. So next question, I think this is a good one, and I've sort of seen a few of these around, but Jane has asked whether it's important to have a device-friendly version of the annual report, which focuses on user experience rather than just a PDF reader. What do you reckon about that, Stephen?
Yeah, it's sort of getting into the realms of that electronic delivery, and we discriminate in the ARA between what we consider to be a print version delivered electronically, which is effectively a PDF or a flip book, and then a genuine web-based interactive report. There are benefits to using the web-based report. in terms of people. It's user-friendly. It's good for a younger audience. They tend to be much more comfortable working with a website. The other problem with it is, though, it really needs to be professionally designed and developed. You can't just have a web page. I think one of the New Zealand ministries last year, the Ministry for Social Development, had a web page. Their annual report was web-based, but it was a single page that rolled on from top to bottom for 250 pages. With limited functionality, with limited linkages. So if you're going to go the web version, it needs to be done properly. Meat and Livestock Australia do a very good interactive style website. They've won the electronic delivery kind of award for a couple of years now. So that's a good idea. But my problem with it is, I think, it's expensive to do it properly. You can achieve quite significant functionality just through using a PDF and ensuring that your contents are clickable, that cross-references move you around within, so that intra-document navigation functionality is used. You can also use it to have it clickable to click off to other links where you might have a little video or you might have more information. So rather than go the full web-based HTML designed report, just utilize the functionality within an interactive PDF to achieve, I guess, some of more of that user interactivity. So I'm not sure. And in terms of cross-platform, I think the question was, is if you, I think if you do deliver it, you really need to make sure that it works on Google, it works on Firefox and Edge, and all the different browsers are able, including mobile applications as well. So you might need to make sure it works on all of those. I think when we first did an electronic one with Gold Coast many years ago, we only had to really worry about Explorer or Firefox. I think they were the only two things that existed. Now it's significantly more complicated. But I'd say probably the cost would be the biggest thing. To do it well on a web-based report, you really have to have a look at the costs, and it can be quite costly.
All right, hopefully that's helpful, Jane.
Hopefully.
Yeah, Belinda has asked whether you have any tips for writing good case studies to go into the annual report.
Do I have any good case studies? Pictures of there are a number of reports out there that do have good case studies in them, and in fact, I'm just trying to think off the top of my head. I looked at some recently. I think New Zealand Inland Revenue, which is essentially their taxation department, had some good case studies. If you want good case studies, what you really need to do is make sure that first of all, that people notice them. So there's no point having a case study in the middle of the report which looks exactly the same as the rest of it. So make sure they stand out a little bit, because they're little highlights you want. The best way to do that is generally people will put a little picture. If you're trying to connect with stakeholders and people, it's a good idea to have pictures of actual people to get that visual kind of interest from the reader, and then make sure that the case study discusses genuine real-world impacts of the work that you do. So I guess that's the best way. It's really about just making it understandable so that the man in the street can look at that and go, oh, okay, these guys do all that, and that's the impact of that. So just make sure you concentrate on the impact in terms of the stakeholders that you are trying to reach. Hopefully that helps.
That's great, thank you. Finn has asked, and I think this is a good question because the impact report phenomena has hit CLCs, I think. So Finn's asked whether you could talk briefly about an impact report versus an annual report. Does an organisation need to produce both of those as separate documents, or can they be combined?
Look, I'll be perfectly honest up front. I've never seen an impact report, so I don't know what an impact report is. I can only assume that it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a report on the impacts of the work you do. A good annual report, I don't see the need for both, because in my view, a good annual report should effectively be an impact report. It's supposed to be reporting on the impacts of the things you do, not on the things you do. Bad annual reports, as I said, are journals. They just sit down and they write 200 pages about the stuff we did. That's fantastic. But what I want to really know is all that stuff you did for a reason, which is the impact. Did you achieve that? So what were the impacts of all the work you did? So in my view, a good annual report contains both what you did and the impact of what you did. So I wouldn't see a need to have separate reports. That'd be my view.
Yes, and I tend to agree. So Finn, over the last couple of years, CLCQ has produced an impact toolkit that you can use, and I've just popped the link into the chat box. And one of the purposes that we've identified for an impact report is to combine that with your annual report. So rather than talking about how many widgets you delivered in your annual report, you're talking about the impact that your organisation has made in the community that you work with. So check that link out in there. And I've also dropped the ARA guide into the chat box as well that Stephen has referred to in this presentation. So we're almost at time. There's just maybe one or two more questions that I think would be great, Stephen, if you wouldn't mind addressing quickly. So I think perhaps this is an obvious one, but perhaps not. So who do you see as the primary audience for the annual report? Who are the stakeholders that CLCs should be looking at targeting with their reports?
Okay, so you guys would have, there's always a number of stakeholders. There's obviously the regulators that want to see the legislative stuff. So that's one group of stakeholders, but they're fairly easy to placate. You just do the things they ask you to do and you send that to them. To get the real value out of your annual report, in terms of charities in particular, there's two groups that you really want to target, I suppose. One are your key customers, your customer base, so those people that you're helping, so that you can kind of let them know, what you're doing and that you're doing good for them. The group that you guys obviously want to target would be the people, your key donors, I suppose. So you need to, and the message to send to both of those groups is quite similar. It's really about engendering a level of trust in your organisation that you are doing the right things with their money and using it in a sensible way, and you're using it in an ethical way. And I think if you can demonstrate that, that's good. There's probably an opportunity to market your organisation as well, particularly to the donors. Just be careful. One of the problems we have with a lot of charities is that they tend to lose sight of the fact that it's a performance report, and they have 85 pages of smiley kids in wheelchairs, which is great, but then they forget to tell everybody why the kids are smiling. And so just make sure that you strike the appropriate balance between marketing and performance. But I'd say your customers are one group, and your donors would be the other key group. And I know that's fairly broad, but it changes for each organisation. It would also change annually depending upon the key messages that you want to send. You may decide, you may make a specific decision that this year we're going to target donors, and as a result, these are the sorts of things we would like to highlight because we want the donors on board. You may decide that this year we're going to target a specific group of our community. For example, there might be an Indigenous group that you say, well, this year we're going to focus on them, and therefore we're going to write a report that is perhaps more sort of more targeted towards them. So you can actually highlight different areas, I guess, or different areas of your stakeholder groups, depending upon the key messages you want to send and what you actually want to achieve as an organisation. And there's no necessity for that to remain static over time. I know that's a little bit ambiguous, but it really is a bit of an individual organisational thing.
Excellent. All right. Well, I think that is everything. Melinda's asked whether you've got recommendations for good annual reports to read as examples for CLCs, but you've already mentioned the Judicial Commission of New South Wales, Cancer Council, New South Wales, Bridge Housing, and a couple of others. So hopefully, Melinda, you can check those out. I might see if I can track them down and pop some links in on our when I sort of send out the recording to this session afterwards. The other thing I wanted to mention just for Queensland CLCs who are incorporated associations is that hopefully you've seen that the Office of Fair Trading has provided an additional 6 months to complete AGMs due to COVID, and that the Department of Justice and Attorney General, who's our main funder here, has also extended that to annual reports, but they are still requesting that CLCs complete their audited financials in the usual timeframe. So that hopefully will give you a bit more time to work on the excellence of your annual reports and make sure that they're doing all the things that Stephen has recommended. So on behalf of everyone who's listening in today, Stephen, thank you so much for presenting to us and for sharing your wisdom and a few jokes with us. So we will pop this recording up online after the session, as I've mentioned, together with all of those links and various other bits and pieces that Stephen's referred to. So thanks so much, Stephen, for coming along and for a great presentation.
All right, no, thanks everybody for listening, and hopefully you'll find some usefulness there. The annual report website, the ARA website, does have quite a lot. We list all our winners, so if you're looking for good reports, just go and have a look at some of those that are on the list for the Gold Awards, and that might help you. A lot of sections we also have is separate for charities and not-for-profits, so you can have a look at those as well.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you so much, and we'll chat to you at our next webinar. Take care, everyone.